This is my new Patreon series, number 45B, part 2. We're going to be continuing our discussion of numinous experience, or the experience of the divine in early Christianity. So let's look at the earliest of the visions that were experienced by the apostles and disciples of Yeshua. There are three types of numinous experience that we can look at. The so-called resurrection visions, but they were of three types as described in Paul's 1 Corinthians 15, which is our earliest report. And of these types, there were three ways that people had visions of Yeshua: individual ways, community ways, and as a theophany. So Paul says Yeshua was seen in a vision, ophthe, by Cephas, Peter, and then to the 12 in Galilee. And after that, he was seen in a vision by more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James in Jerusalem, and to all the apostles, and last of all, he was seen in a vision by me also. Now, when Paul is writing this is in AD 50, the visions that he was talking about, that people have fallen asleep, people who had visions of Yeshua have died since then, happened maybe a generation before. Now, as I've explained before, the word that Paul uses is from horao. It's ophthe, or it's ophthing, to see in a vision, as opposed to seeing physically with the eyes. So we will find this term used by Paul and others who describe the visions of the resurrections, visions of Yeshua, in the before the time of Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. And then after that, he was seen in a vision, the same word, ophthe, he was seen in a vision by more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. Now this would be a kind of a community vision that was shared. And finally, he was seen in a vision by me also. That would be probably classified as a theophany. What Paul saw was not what the other people saw. He did not see Jesus as he knew him, because he never knew him. He had no image in his mind of what Yeshua would look like that the other people did have. Now, this happened in Galilee. The first visions were recorded in Galilee, and that's what the Gospel of Mark, the original shorter ending, which was written in the first century, and the longer ending was written a century and a half later or more. In the short ending, the ladies go in and they see a young man, which is a name for an angel, and he tells them that he has gone before you into Galilee, and there you will see him in a vision. And that's the same word. You will see him in a vision in Galilee. And finally, after that, after these experiences had been recorded, and perhaps Peter and other disciples had come back to Jerusalem or sent messages to James, who was in Jerusalem, he appeared to James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem. Now here, Paul, about AD 52, represents Peter as the first witness of the resurrection. He never mentions Mary Magdalene, which is the way things are told a couple of generations later in Matthew and Luke's Gospel. So we have the individuals. Peter is the first in Galilee, in Capernaum, where his hometown is. Later in Jerusalem, James. They have personal visions of Yeshua in the physical form they had known him, in his nephesh, as we explained before. Then there were community experiences. The 12 apostles, and later more than 500 of Yeshua's disciples and followers, experienced group visions of Yeshua at the same time, as he says, in the physical form they had known him, in his nephesh. And finally, Paul experiences, several years later, a theophany in the form of blinding light and a voice, not a resurrection vision of the nephesh of Yeshua. Paul had not known or followed Yeshua, probably had never seen him in person to be able to form an image in his mind of his physical form, and did not experience anything during the 40-day period after the crucifixion. I say these so-called resurrection visions because resurrection, the Greek anastasis from the Hebrew chema, as taught by Yeshua, occurred for the righteous about 40 days after physical death, when the nephesh dissolved and the soul, the neshama, ascended into the olam of God, the heavenly eternities of God, and, quote, in the resurrection souls neither marry, that is, they're not male, nor are given in marriage, they're not female, but become like the angels in the heavens. And that's a very old, authentic saying of Yeshua. We find it in Q and in M, which is taken from Mark and Matthew and Luke repeat it. Now we're going to take a look at a probable timeline of the occurrence of these individual and group visions and the theophany. Friday morning, April 3rd, AD 33, a time we can actually date with some clear probability, I will explain later. Yeshua was paraded by Roman soldiers to Golgotha for a public crucifixion as an example and warning to revolutionaries. Male disciples remained hidden in the crowd as Yeshua had probably commanded in order to save his disciples from being a similar fate. But female relatives were allowed to approach, and that was the custom. This was the day the Passover lambs were butchered, and so Yeshua becomes the Lamb of God in this chronology that's carried forward by Paul and John's Gospel from the older Syrian Cilician understandings of Christology. Now, Yeshua had died by Friday afternoon. His corpse was taken down and given to women who had permission to have the corpse transported to a newly constructed tomb donated by Nicodemus, according to what we're told. They hurriedly wrapped the body before the high holy day, which was a Passover Sabbath, sunset, a Saturday which would be when the Passover had been prepared Friday night and would be eaten Saturday night. So they had to get the body ready before this high holy day, when food for the Saturday afternoon Passover feast was prepared from the slaughtered lambs. And in their haste, they used a shroud with a headband to keep the jaws closed, but there was no time before sunset for other funerary preparations. They planned to return to finish after the first sunrise following the Saturday Sabbath or Sunday morning. Now, Friday sunset, the Jewish Saturday High Holy Day Passover Shabbat, a lunar eclipse rises in the east, and this is what astronomy can show us by going back to that time and seeing what was going on in the sky. The moon turns blood red. In Acts 2:14-21, it was reported that the moon turned to blood and the sun turned to darkness at the time of the resurrection. This observation also appears in the report of Pilate, which is written by Pilate to Emperor Tiberius. If this is taken as a lunar eclipse, and this is the way it would have to be taken, then the crucifixion can be exactly dated. Lunar eclipses were frequently described in exactly this way, even verbatim, by contemporary historians. Described in exactly this way, and this is what we have. There was only one lunar eclipse visible from Jerusalem at the time of the Passover in the period from AD 26 to 36. It occurred on Friday, April 3rd, AD 33. The moon rose above the horizon, already in the midst of eclipse, and would have progressively turned to blood as the eclipse continued. That's from a report by Humphreys and Waddington. Now, the Sunday morning sunrise, the women found an empty tomb and told Peter. Peter and the Galilean apostles began the trek back to Capernaum. Now Luke later, 2 generations later, attributes the first vision to Cleopas, who was Yeshua's uncle, he and an unnamed disciple on the road to Emmaus after the crucifixion. But historically, probably, this is what actually happened. Now Peter had a vision of Yeshua that he reported to the other Galilean apostles who were his employees. They were fishermen that he employed. And they convened a Thanksgiving Toda. This is somewhere between April 7th and April 10th. Now the apostles experienced a group vision of Yeshua probably during the same or another Toda, sometime from April through May. At a large gathering of Yeshua's Galilean disciples convened by Peter and the apostles sometime in May, quote, over 500 of the brethren experienced a vision of Yeshua. And after news of the visions came to James, the brother of Yeshua, in Jerusalem, he experienced a personal vision of Yeshua and was appointed by Peter and John to oversee or to act as bishop and protect the Jerusalem church because of his high office in the temple. He was an assistant to the high priest, and we read many other things that tell us that he was able to enter the Holy of Holies and actually carry on priestly work for the high holy days. That's sometime in May. Now, when the vision ceased, about 40 days later, Peter and the disciples shared the Toda as a liturgy for invoking the spiritual presence of Yeshua. And that was with Maran Atha, as we have just explained in the first part of this presentation. With the Syrian, Cilician, and other congregations they established as apostles. So that seems to be the timeline of these visions, of these resurrection visions. Now, what about these resurrection visions attributed to Mary Magdalene? Now, more than a decade after Paul transmitted his paradosis about post-crucifixion visions of Yeshua, Mary is represented as one of the first witnesses of the empty tomb in the original ending of Mark 16, 7 and 8, written somewhere around AD 65 to 68. And they are told, but go and tell his disciples and to Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him in a vision, Ophsesthe, as he told you. Then they went out and fled from the tomb, seized with trembling and bewilderment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, the first post-crucifixion visions were experienced by Peter and the apostles in Galilee, probably at Capernaum, where most of them lived and worked. Now, about AD 80 to 90, we have this report. According to St. Matthew 28, 1 to 10, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. An earthquake occurred, and an angel dressed in white descended from heaven and rolled aside the stone as the women were watching. The angel told them that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then the risen Jesus himself appeared to the women as they were leaving the tomb and told them to tell the other disciples that he would meet them in Galilee. This is about 80 to 90 in Matthew's Gospel. Now, according to Luke, which is written a little bit later, a group of unnamed women went to the tomb and found the stone already rolled away, as in Mark, not as in Matthew. They went inside and saw 2 young men. That's the term for angels, is young men, dressed in white, who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then they went and told the 11 remaining apostles, who dismissed their story as nonsense. In Luke's account, Jesus never appears to the women, but instead makes his first appearance to Cleopas, that's Yeshua's uncle, and an unnamed disciple on the road to Emmaus. Now, Luke's narrative also removes the injunction for the women to tell the disciples to return to Galilee, and instead has Jesus tell the disciples not to return to Galilee, but rather to stay in the precincts of Jerusalem. Now, this is because Luke Acts is more of a Gentile gospel, and it bases its It's history and apostolic stuff on Peter as the main apostle and disciple. And Luke actually represents Peter, not James, as leader of the Jerusalem church, which is not historical. There are other reasons for that. Now, about AD 100 to 110, I'm going to quote you from an article, a good article on Wikipedia. Mary Magdalene's role in the resurrection narrative is greatly increased in the account from the Gospel of John. According to John 20, 1 to 10, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb alone when it was still dark and saw that the stone had already been rolled away. She did not see anyone, but immediately ran to tell Peter and the beloved disciple who came with her, probably John, and confirmed that it was empty, but returned home to Capernaum without seeing the risen Jesus. But then, according to John 20, 11, 18, Mary, now alone in the garden, outside the tomb, saw two angels sitting where Jesus' body had been. Then the risen Jesus approached her. She at first mistook him for the gardener. She did not see his physical form. But after she heard him say her name, she recognized him and cried out, Rabboni, which is Aramaic for teacher. She tried to touch him, but he told her, don't touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Jesus then sent her to tell the other apostles the good news of his resurrection. The Gospel of John, therefore, portrays Mary Magdalene as the first apostle, the apostle sent to the apostles. She is the first to use the standard creedal formula of the apostles, I have seen the Lord, John 12, 18, which Paul uses in 1 Corinthians to claim apostolic status. Now, why are visions attributed to Mary Magdalene not reported by Paul, Mark, or Matthew? Mary's post-crucifixion visions were not part of Q, or the Aramaic Corps of Thomas, or Paul's parodosis in the apostolic period, about AD 33 to 49 or 50. In Mark, about AD 65, 68, she's reported only as a witness of the empty tomb. And this is probably not because of a systematic male suppression of Mary's importance, which did occur later, AD 75 to 85, when male church leadership was asserted and women were no longer allowed in that role, but simply because she did not experience the post-crucifixion visions. But Mary's importance looms large in John's Gospel, where she's portrayed as the first witness of the resurrection, about AD 100 to 110. From accounts in Paul and later in Acts of John, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Yeshua, traveled with the young apostle John to Ephesus in Asia Minor. Now, John was young enough to be maybe the youngest child of Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and to be a child of Mary Magdalene. They were the age of what his mother would have been, of John Zebedee's mother. But they traveled with the young apostle John to Ephesus because John was seeking refuge from the persecution of Herod Agrippa I, who in AD 44 beheaded John's brother James, James, the son of Zebedee. Now, John was not present for the Council of Jerusalem, presided over by James, the brother of Yeshua, in AD 49, because he and Mary Magdalene were establishing the churches in Asia Minor. He wasn't there. Now, Mary Magdalene was the inner circle disciple of Yeshua who advised and guided the young apostle John with her own channeled visions until she died of old age in Ephesus, probably about age 70, in AD 63, before the destruction of Jerusalem, within a year of the death of Mary, the mother of Yeshua, who was never a disciple, but was later conflated in legend with Mary Magdalene in the Eastern Christian legends of the Dormition of Mary, the death of Mary. Magdala, tower, was probably the initiatic name given her by Yeshua, like the names Boanerges, the voice of thunder, for James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and Cephas, or rock, for Peter. Now, if you see the three-part presentation on Mary Magdalene at the Louis Kaiser YouTube channel, go to the videos page and search for MM to get more information on this. Apparently, the visions channeled by Mary Magdalene associated with her with the original resurrection vision legends. Her channeled visions influenced Johannine theology and Christology as it evolved in the years AD 44 and following. She was terribly significant because she was the guide of John and Johannine theology that would develop in Asia Minor, and was probably possibly the inspiration for the sacrificial atonement interpretation of the Eucharist, and for presenting Yeshua's sermons about the Bar Enosh in John's Gospel as sermons about himself as a divine Son of Man, and probably responsible for the I am sayings, and for the concept of the Paraclete, and for the attribution to Jesus of the opening Logos hymn of John's Gospel. And Paul's years with the Johannine churches of Asia Minor would have introduced him to all of this, his years in Cilicia. And all this was influenced by this very powerful channel, Mary of Magdala, Mary the Tower. And that is why she becomes so important in association with resurrection legends in Christianity. The conflict of anti-feminism in the late first century churches, in contrast to the increasing importance of Marian revelations, Mary's revelations about the divinity of Jesus Christ that influenced not only Johannine but also Pauline theology, may have been what produced the late legends of Mary Magdalene as first witness to the resurrection. We don't know. There just isn't enough clear evidence, but this is, I think, good speculation. Now, Yeshua's practices of private wilderness retreat and prayer and meditation, Jewish meditation, are reported in the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Let's take a look at some of these instances. At once the Spirit sent Jesus out into the desert. This is after he was baptized by John. And he was in the desert 40 days being tested by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and the angels attended him. And that's how Mark states it. But later, 2 generations later, Matthew and Luke expand it radically into that whole pericope about the, and maybe trope, about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan, who takes him and puts him on the pinnacle of the temple and all that stuff. But it's a clear indication that Yeshua went out into the wilderness in order to pray and meditate. In Mark's first chapter, he says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. In Luke chapter 5, he says Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed by himself. In Luke 6, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. Now, these memorials and reminiscences of Yeshua's going into a retreat and praying also reflect what Christian practice would have been at that time. People would have gone to solitary places to pray and meditate. Yeshua says, don't do your prayers publicly. Go and lock yourself inside your own closet and do your prayers privately with God, and so on. In Matthew 14, when Jesus heard that John the Baptist had been beheaded, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. In Mark 6, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. He takes his disciples with him. In Matthew 14, after Jesus had dismissed the crowds, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was still there alone. So he also taught his disciples techniques of Jewish meditation. The most obvious one, which we've discussed in other presentations, is the so-called transfiguration, where he takes the three disciples with initiatic names, James, Peter, and John, That would be Cephas, the rock, and John and Peter, Boanerges, those of the thunder voices. He takes them up to witness an ascent into the third heaven. Now, the Aramaic word mishkad, from Aramaic and Hebrew shakad, meaning to vigil or meditate or contemplate or keep spiritual watch, is the root of the New Testament Greek verb gregorein, to watch, that is used in all the gospel watch commands, such as Mark 13:37, what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. Now, like the little apocalypse of Mark 13, where this command is given, the eschatological prophecies are not authentic teachings of Yeshua. He did not teach eschatology. He was an apocalypticist. He taught revelation about the future and the future of humanity. Instead, this little apocalypse and these eschatological predictions about the end of the world and so on may reflect his warnings about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but they definitely reflect Jewish eschatology of the later apostolic period, which gets elaborated in the later book of Revelations. And Paul probably learned his eschatological doctrines about the second coming and the end of the world and so on from the Syrian Christian synagogues where he sojourned for many years after his conversion. In the New Testament Gospel pericopes, Gregorian watch meant watch for the end of the world, the Pauline second coming, reflected in the little apocalypse of Mark 13 and various parables that we can find in Mark and later. But they are not authentic teachings of Yeshua. The so-called transfiguration, as I said, probably reflects Yeshua initiating Peter, James, and John, all of them were given initiatic names, into a lesser form of MERKABAH, ascent. If you go to my YouTube channel, go to the videos and look for pre-C number 8, MERKABAH mysticism, you'll get a lot more information on this. So let's take a look at Paul's MERKABAH ascent to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians 12. In the Gentile Pauline churches, personal revelation was considered to be equal in validity, sometimes more authentic than actual apostolic teachings of the historical disciples of Yeshua. That's among the Gentiles and Hellenistic religion and so on. The speaking in tongues, channeling, all this sort of thing was a way of getting a better connection with the deity than just having learned what Yeshua had to say historically. Now here in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul is defending his claim to be an apostle by citing his own MERKABAH ascent, even though he'd never been a disciple of Yeshua, because secret MERKABAH experience was apparently considered to be evidence of initiation and apostleship in early Christianity. He says, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ, he's talking about himself, who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Now 14 years ago, that would have been in the mid-30s at some point when he was in Cilicia and Asia Minor and so on. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. So the third heaven would be the place where James, John, and Peter saw Moses and Elijah speaking with Jesus. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to the third heaven of paradise. Now, in the third heaven, the Enochian scheme of the heavens is that on one side of the third heaven is paradise, the other side is Gehenna, heaven and hell. So the 10 heavens, the scheme of the 10 heavens used by Yeshua's disciples, both the Pardes and Gehenna, purgatory, existed in the third heaven. He, I, Paul, meaning I, Paul, heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. Well, in Pharisaic tradition, and Paul was a Pharisee, it was forbidden to discuss MERKABAH visions publicly, and this is why he says, I know a man who. But that would have been considered to be a real breach of ethics among Pharisaic mystics to discuss MERKABAH visions and this sort of thing. But Paul uses it as a tool to give himself creds with the Gentiles. Now let's look at practices of private prayer and meditation among the early Christians. Prayer was done in private as well as in congregational settings. Matthew reports in the 6th chapter of Yeshua says, and when you pray, you must not be like the self-righteous, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have merely received the approval of men. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Abba who is in secret. The term in Greek is en crypto, in mysteriously hidden. And your Abba who sees in secret, en crypto, approves you. So private prayer in crypto was practiced by Essenes and the Jerusalem Nazarenes, headed by James, brother of Yeshua. It was practiced by the ancient prophets of Israel in the northern kingdom of Galilee, where Yeshua's home of Nazareth was located. Private prayer was probably spoken aloud, but with the condition, and when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Matthew was part of a community that was continuing to practice Torah, the Jewish Christian community, and so the way Gentiles did things was considered to be impious. Now, most scholars agree that Matthew's gospel was composed in Syria for Jewish Christians who continued to follow Jewish customs, like the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. Luke, with who represented the Roman Gentile churches, omitted, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, because he didn't want to insult the Gentiles. Now, private prayer was probably practiced with contemplative meditation. Meditate, the word meditate, the Greek meleta, which is equivalent to Hebrew Aramaic yega. Paul says, meditate upon these things, give thyself wholly to them, that thy profiting may appear to all. 1 Timothy 4:15. He's advising people not just to think, but to meditate, take them deeply into private thought. He is probably keeping in mind Psalm number 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is the law of Yahweh, and in his law doth he meditate, yega, day and night. In that case, it means something more like contemplation. So let's take a look at first and second century parallels to God's invisible presence in early Christianity. One that is used much by scholars and people are very interested in is the Hermetic vision of Poimandres, the Hermetic literature, the literature of Hermes Trismegistus, that is contemporary with end of first century literature, Christian literature, that is used to understand some of the late first century Christian literature. This is a book that you can get many places, Poimandres, the Shepherd of Mankind. I like this translation by Newcomb. You might want to find that on Amazon. So Poimandres, the Shepherd of Mankind, the seer, the visionary person who seeks a vision, has a vision. He's put himself into a meditative state, and something appears to him, and so here's what he says. I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I am Poimandres," which means the shepherd of mankind, the mind of the highest reality. I know what your soul desires, and I am with you everywhere. Femi ego sugartis e, etc. This is the same phrase we find in the Christian thing where Yeshua says, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world, and Matthew and so on. I'm with you everywhere. The risen Christ says, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And that is written in that last part of the century, the first century. So there's definitely some kind of cross-influence. We compare Paul's claim in 1 Corinthians, for though absent in body, I am present in spirit. And if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present, with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. This idea that the sinner who apparently was having sex with his mother or something like that had to be kicked out of the congregation. That's what delivered over to Satan, that he was no longer under the protection of the Lord Yeshua. And this is reflected in Matthew's channeled message of Christ to his church. If your brother sins against you, go and confront him privately. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, then take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. That was Jewish law, and Matthew was a Jewish Christian gospel. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, regard him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's a term meaning whatever rules you make, whatever interpretations of Torah that you make on earth will be honored in the heavenly places. Again, I tell you truly that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather together in my name, there I am with them. And that's why I've chosen that as the lead title for this section, for these 2 presentations on the experience of the divine in early Christianity. Now this is the end of the presentation.